Hi, I'm Giovanni Cavaletto with Index Fresh, and today we are doing the labor installment of the Index Fresh Avocado Cultural Seminar Series. We're going to look at labor from three different perspectives, from three different speakers. Bryan Little from the Farm Employer Labor Service, a subsidiary of California Farm Bureau, will talk to us about some of the legal things going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento concerning immigration and potential immigration reform.
I'm Bryan Little. I am with the Farm Employers Labor Service. Farm Employers Labor Service is a small for-profit company owned and operated by California Farm Bureau Federation. And FEL's purpose is to try to help agricultural employers understand and do correctly all of the things that agricultural employers are expected to do under state and federal law and under state and federal regulations in California. I spent about 7 years, I worked in Washington, D.C. for about 25 years before I came to California in 2008, and about 10 of those years I spent doing agricultural labor and employment issues for American Farm Bureau in Washington. At that time, primary occupation was immigration reform, which is something we'll be talking about a little bit today. But one thing I learned in that time is that you all have the dubious distinction of being the most heavily regulated agricultural employers in the country. Congratulations. You guys have more you need to worry about than anybody else does. One of the cool things about coming to California is that when I was with American, I often tried to get something like FEL started on a national level. But there just wasn't enough critical mass to make something like that happen. And I have long believed that if FELS didn't exist, we'd have to create it because farmers need that help in getting things done. I'd encourage you to go back and have a look at my stuff on the back table when we break for the day, and I'll be back there to talk to you about that stuff if you want to talk a little bit more. So what I'm here to talk to you about is the farm labor availability outlook for our industry in upcoming years. Over the last few years, we have had pretty significant shortages of agricultural labor, and I think I don't need to tell all of you that. You've probably lived it over the last few years. California Farm Bureau surveyed our membership the last 2 growing seasons, and what we found consistently was that our growers were telling us that they were about 30% short of labor during their peak usage periods of time. So the way we usually translate that to people in the news media who don't understand anything, you don't repeat to them 3 times, generally speaking, is that if you need 10 crews, you have 7. If you need 100 people, you have 70. And that has an impact on people's decisions about cultural practices, about how they handle harvest decisions, about the economics of how you spend money on that extra labor input and whether you can expect to recoup that expense and actually improve your profit situation in the business that you're running. So it's had a real impact. It's been a real hardship for a lot of agricultural employers in California over the last couple of years. The silver lining to the gray cloud is that the drought probably is going to ease our labor shortages this season, which is not the way you would want that to happen, but that's likely to be the impact, to the point that I've spent a little time on the phone with my counterparts in Michigan and Wisconsin and Illinois over the last few weeks who have heard about our drought and are wondering if we might be willing to send them some of our farm workers. These are people I worked with when I was at American Farm Bureau, and I usually have to sort of hesitate a little and say, you know, one of these days this drought might be over and we might need these people. Plus, I don't think your average California farm worker would like the climate in the wintertime in Michigan very much. If you've ever been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So it's kind of a ticklish situation that we find ourselves in. We're kind of in a you're damned if you do and damned if you don't situation. But you look overall at the big picture of what we're looking at with agricultural labor in the country as a whole. Depending on whose estimates you want to believe, there are somewhere between 1.5 million to 3 million farm workers. We think from experience that some of them wind up being double counted. And that's nationally, by the way. That's not just in California. We think some of those people wind up being double counted to the extent they might have 2 or 3 or 4 jobs over the course of a season. USDA's and Department of Labor's reporting mechanisms are a long way from perfect. There's a lot of slack in them. So we don't know how many of those people are actually being counted 2 or 3 or 4 times as a result of having 2 or 3 or 4 jobs over the course of a season. In California, the Employment Development Department tells us that our industry employs about 400,000 people, more or less, at peak seasons during the middle part of the year. And that's a pretty substantial cohort of agricultural workers that we have in this state. The next biggest agricultural employer state after us is Florida, and their peak season employment is about 35,000. So you're talking about a magnitude of more than 10 more than the next biggest state, and that kind of makes us the big dog on the block when it comes to how agricultural labor markets fit together, how it impacts markets for agricultural labor, and what employers have to do in states like Oregon and Washington, for which we are sender states for them for their picking seasons when they need to have workers. And it has an impact on the whole. It's like ripples in a pond. It tends to have an impact on everything else that goes on. National estimates of the total number of farm workers out there in the whole universe as a whole has varied over the years. You go back to 1990 and your estimates, and you can see these are pretty broad ranges, anywhere from 1.14 million to 3 million. I think, again, that's a product of the potential that people are being double counted when they get more than one job over the course of a season. But what was interesting is that between 1990 and 2007, the best numbers we have indicate that the labor pool shrunk somewhat during those periods of time. I don't know exactly what happened there. It may have been a consequence of what so often happens with agricultural land, that your last crop rotation is from whatever it was you were growing to townhouses. Or it may have been farmers making the transition to less labor-intensive commodities. I can tell you that in Northern California, a lot of the people that I know who are growing cling peaches, never mind the fact that cling peaches are not something that's a real popular consumer product these days, but people who are growing cling peaches are pushing their peach trees out to put in almonds and walnuts and things like that don't require as much labor as cling peaches or prunes or things like that. So they're making that transition partly as a result of not having as much labor as they would ideally like to have to be able to do that economically, as well as a very attractive market for commodities like almonds and walnuts and pistachios and things like that. So that may be part of the transition that's going on here. It's kind of hard to pin all of these effects down and be able to know exactly what's causing what thing to happen. But I think it's a pretty clear trend line that we're seeing, that the overall labor force is getting smaller as time goes by. And I feel like we can have some pretty good, that there's some pretty reliable numbers. They come from a survey conducted by the Department of Labor called the National Agricultural Worker Survey. So the last 8 years I lived in Washington, I worked at the Labor Department, and one of the things I did was work with the people who do the National Agricultural Worker Survey. It's a survey they do on a 4-year cycle on an ongoing basis, so they have a very, very good picture of what demographics and employment and family sizes, family situations, and things like that. They interview about 4,000 farm workers from across the country every year, weighted to states like California, Florida, Oregon, Washington, North Carolina, that employ a lot of farm workers. And they give you a very comprehensive picture of their lives, of what's going on in their lives, how many of them are actually working in ag. The result of this has been that, as you can see, at least at one of that survey seems to be showing that the size of the labor force is declining, and the information we get from the USDA's Economic Research Service also seems to confirm that the overall labor force is getting smaller over time. So in California, EDD numbers tell us, as I said before, that we get about 488 to 500,000 people working in our industry during peak seasons. But what's also interesting about our industry is that being a $43 billion industry, we also employ a lot of people. We employ about 48 or 50,000 people every single day in this industry that go to work and do the work that needs to be done to keep this industry going, over and above the people that we have to hire for peak harvest seasons. So it's a substantial industry that supports a lot of other economic activity. The typical multiplier that I've seen agricultural economists use when they talk about the number of jobs that are impacted by every field job in agriculture is somewhere between 3 and 5. So that's a pretty substantial multiplier, and you guys see it and feel it every day in communities that are probably a little bit further away from Los Angeles, and we see it very clearly out in the Central Valley. A lot of these towns where agriculture is the dominant industry and it contributes to everything else that goes on around there. So where are these farm workers from? Well, nationally, 72% of them are foreign born, 68% of them are from Mexico. 45% of them are coming from what we think of as the traditional sender states in northern Mexico. But we're getting more and more of them coming from other states that are further south, and even starting to see a trickle coming from other Central American countries as well. This trend line of people starting to come from some of these southern Mexican states is starting to create some new challenges as an industry for the regulators that we work with and other people like that, because we're starting to encounter language problems, issues with being able to finding ways to communicate with people so that you can do safety training, so that you can inform them of so that the regulators and the enforcers can inform these people of what their legal rights are and issues like that, working with them in terms of getting their immigration status straightened out. So communication is becoming a greater challenge as a result of this change in where workers are coming from. In California, 98% of our workforce is foreign-born. That's according to Phil Martin at UC Davis, who's been doing research on agricultural labor markets for about 35 years now. 93% of them work in the fruit, vegetable, and horticultural sector, so that's a pretty heavy concentration. I think we all know the reasons why that's true. According to Phil, in an average year, they're working about 190 days a year, and what they're doing the rest of the time is finding work in other industries and in other types of occupations, as well in some cases as drawing unemployment and having other ways of piecing together income over the course of a year. One thing you should keep in mind is that one statistic that we've heard consistently over the years is that agricultural workers' cash income from earnings from a job is relatively low. It's around the neighborhood of $18,000 to $20,000 a year, and that doesn't sound like very much. But it's important to keep in mind that a big part of that probably has to do with the fact that they work about 190 days a year. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're talking to people about the overall economic situation of our industry and about the people who work in our industry. And also, according to Phil, about 68% of these people told someone who said that he was from UC Davis, so kind of connected to the government. 68% of them have acknowledged to Phil over the years that they're unauthorized, that they're not legally present in the United States. And that's a pretty significant, I think, a pretty significant statistic. That's also borne out by the other survey I was telling you about before, the National Agricultural Workers Survey, where in that case they have someone who represents themselves to agricultural workers and says, I am from the United States government and I'm here to ask you questions about your life. And over 50% of them typically acknowledge that they're not legally authorized to be in the United States. If half of them are willing to tell someone that they know is from the U.S. government, even if they don't know that the U.S. government, how siloed it is, and how nobody talks to anybody else, which is why nothing ever gets done the way it ought to get done. They don't know that. So they're telling someone who says, I'm from the U.S. government, that I'm not legally eligible to be here. If 1 out of 2 is willing to do that, you can bet that the real number of people who are not authorized is probably considerably larger than that. And the working number we typically use when we talk to policymakers and politicians and media and people like that, the typical number we use is about 70%, we think, are probably not authorized and legally eligible to be in the United States. We compete with industries like construction and hospitality for our labor force, although their concentrations of unauthorized workers are probably not as high as ours are, except when the economy starts to pick up. And that's when these unauthorized numbers start to grow a little bit for those industries as well. So when the hospitality industry is doing well, when they're going great guns, they tend to pick up employment, and a lot of that slack winds up being taken up by people who are no more legally authorized than a lot of the workers we have in our industry. Same thing happened in construction back during the boom in 2005, 6, 7, and 8. When we were building houses, I didn't live in Sacramento yet, but when I moved there in 2008, I could see the evidence of the fact that for a long time there, they were building houses as fast as they could put them up and selling them about as fast as they could put them up. And when we moved into our house, which had been a foreclosure that we bought from the bank, it was evident from the neighborhoods right around us, there were a lot of half-finished houses that remained half-finished for 2 or 3 years. And what was happening during that time frame in agriculture with their labor force is that a lot of people who had been working in agriculture found out that they could get other jobs, framing houses, hanging drywall, doing landscaping work, doing roofing, and things like that. And a lot of them migrated out of the industry. So during that time period, the people that preceded me at California Farm Bureau were wrestling with problems in places like Lake County, where you might not know, in Lake County they grow a lot of pears up that way of all varieties that you've ever heard of. And there are acres and acres and acres of pears and wine grapes up there. And they were having a really hard time getting enough people to come and harvest all of the pears. They left a lot of them on the ground or a lot of them on the tree in 2005 and 2006. And that was the first time we went through the round with local media in Sacramento with us saying, hey, we've got a shortage of agricultural workers. And as I was talking with Don a little earlier, they were calling us, we were getting moms calling us wanting to get a job for their 20-something son who had never had a job in his life and was spending most of his life sitting in front of his PlayStation on the couch, and us having to explain to mom that, well, maybe your son's not real well suited for doing agricultural work. Maybe he's not the right person, and that's not the right job for him. Pretty hard to explain that to a mom sometimes. But the point is, we've seen this situation before. When we had labor shortages over the last 2 years, it was like deja vu all over again. And I can remember the guy who was the National Affairs Coordinator who was handling a lot of this stuff for California Farm Bureau calling me when he saw me on TV on Channel 3 and on Channel 10 and saw me quoted in the Sacramento Bee saying, I did exactly the same thing back in 2004 and 5 and 6. Same story, same explanations about why we don't have enough workers, and it's amazing how quickly people sometimes forget. There we go. When I worked in Washington, I started at American Farm Bureau in 1995, my predecessor told me that the most important thing I'd be doing while I was at American Farm Bureau was getting immigration reform passed. So here we are in 2014. We have yet to pass any significant immigration reform after the 1986 bill that did the big farm worker amnesty and adjusted all the temporary worker programs and all the other stuff that bill did. We had another sort of retrenchment in 1996 where we really clamped down on a lot of the legal permanent resident alien visa quotas and other things like that, instituted the 3-year bar and the 10-year bar for someone who's here illegally would not be able to get an immigration benefit, depending on how long they're here illegally. If they're found and caught by the Border Patrol or by ICE for 3 years or 10 years, depending on how long they were in the United States in legal status. During that time, I got to know a gentleman who's now since deceased named James Holt, who had been an ag economist at the University of Pennsylvania. And because the time he was in Pennsylvania agriculture was a lot more labor intensive than it is now, he got interested in these issues about how labor and employment works in agriculture as an industry. So he testified a lot at Capitol Hill. We used him for a lot of research and things like that. And Jim's best estimate at the time was, and I think it's probably still true, that about 40 to 60% of the cost of goods sold in labor-intensive commodities is composed of labor. That's a very, very, in a production type of economic activity, that's a pretty high percentage that goes just to the people that you employ to do that work. Now, there are a lot of other occupations like real estate and banking and law and things like that where you're going to have a higher percentage of the cost of producing what you produce is going to be the people that produce it. But for something where you're producing a tangible product like this, that's a very, very high percentage. It also shows you that when we start to have ripples in terms of the price of labor, the availability of labor, and other issues, and the regulation of labor, that it has a real impact on the industry and on our industry's ability to continue to be viable. Or is labor-intensive agriculture going to go the way of fresh market tomatoes, where we develop a machine to harvest all of it and we don't employ nearly as many people as we used to? Or do we go the way of raisins, where we have a lot less people cutting raisins and laying them down on paper trays in between the rows in Fresno County than we had 25 years ago? So we're kind of at an interesting fork in the road right now about which way this industry is going to go. Are we going to look more like Illinois and Iowa and South Dakota and Minnesota, where we're kind of monocultural, growing one or two things that are harvested by machine? Or are we going to continue to be able to take advantage of the unique geographic location we have here, the unique climates, more than one climate, that we have here in California, and continue to grow 400 commodities that consumers seem to want to buy? So who's been short on workers? Well, all of these states have been chronically short on workers. What's different in 2013 and 14 and going into 2015 with the debate in Washington on immigration reform is that in years past, the concern about whether or not we're going to have adequate numbers of agricultural workers has largely been a California phenomenon. That's not true anymore. We have people from all states talking about the need to get enough workers, and part of that is due to border enforcement. Part of that's due to an economy that's slowly beginning to recover. Housing construction is beginning to come back very, very slowly. But what's also happening is that in a lot of states like Georgia and Alabama, they're making themselves less and less welcoming to immigrants all the time. The result of that is that in Alabama, people are having, and you might not know this, but there's a little bit of labor-intensive agriculture that goes on there. They're having a hell of a time getting a lot of this stuff harvested that they want to get harvested. Same thing is going on in Georgia right now. In North Louisiana, well, North Louisiana, and if you like yams, if you like sweet potatoes, North Louisiana and North Carolina are the sweet potato capitals of the world. They grow more sweet potatoes there than any place else on the face of the planet, and sweet potatoes by their nature are hand harvested. But you might, as you might imagine, northern Louisiana is a little bit off the beaten path for migrant workers, so they have a really hard time getting enough people to do what they need to do, and they're kind of at a tipping point right now where they're going to decide to either continue growing yams or go to grow sugar beets instead, which you don't really need very many people to do. So there's some real suffering out there, and people from all states out there talking now about the need to do this. Just yesterday in Washington at the National Press Club, 4 farmers from different regions of the country, if all 4 major regions of the country, the Northwest, West, South, and Southeast, were all in Washington talking to policymakers, media people, and people like that about the need to do something about it. California, we sent a guy who some of you might know. He's from Santa Maria. His name is Carlos Castaneda. Carlos is, I think, right now the president of the San Luis Obispo County Farm Bureau. And he's a very articulate, very intelligent guy. Did a great job representing us. But he was out there. The guy that spoke just before him was a guy who runs the largest peach farm in southeastern United States called Titan Farms. And he was out there explaining his concern about not having enough labor when they're 1 state away from the biggest labor supply state in the eastern United States, and that's Florida. So when Chalmers, and I've known Chalmers for many years, he took that business over from his dad and his uncle. When Chalmers doesn't have enough people to harvest his peaches, it's the kind of thing where he's big enough in that region that when he sneezes, everybody else catches a cold. So you can bet that everyone is having a hard time getting enough people to do what they need to do if Chalmers is having a hard time getting enough people to do what he needs to do. And you can see that we have a really interesting selection of states here who are having problems getting enough people to do what they need to do. Giovanni asked me to talk to you a little bit about what it takes to get someone legal in the United States, how you would go about doing that. There are a lot of ways that it could potentially be done, and there are also a lot of places where you can trip up along the way. There are some categories that are where it's relatively easy to get someone in as a legal permanent resident alien, like immediate relative categories, where U.S. citizens can petition for immediate relatives, including children who are under the age of 21, and that can be accomplished in less than a year in many cases. When you start getting into preference categories that are one further step removed from the person who's making the petition, when you're talking about unmarried adult children, or when you're talking about the petitioner being a legal permanent resident alien rather than a citizen of the United States, it starts to get harder, it starts to get a lot more expensive, it starts to take a lot more time, and if the person you're petitioning for is from Mexico or the Philippines, you're talking about a decade in some cases, just depending on how the process goes. And believe me, the process is by no means uniform. It depends on where you are, who you're talking to, and how good your lawyer is as to how long it might take you to work your way through that process. But you can see that with married adult children from the Philippines and from Mexico, you're talking about a process, and I got this from some immigration lawyers that I've known for a long time who do this sort of thing every day. You're talking about that taking anywhere from 8 to 18 years. And that's a long time to try to pull your family back together. If you've got part of your family in one country and another part of your family here, that's a long time and a lot of money to try to have a family that's living in 2 different countries. The preference categories also allow for legal permanent residents to apply for status for minor, for spouse, for unmarried children, unmarried adult children, and that's another very lengthy process as well. So there are ways to do it, but it can be a very lengthy and painful, time-consuming and expensive process. Another thing that's very common in the high-tech industry is to get workers through what's called the H1B program. H visas are named after a part of the United States Code where you have 3 different temporary non-immigrant worker categories. One is for high-tech workers and people with college degrees, and then there are 2 so-called unskilled worker categories, one for unskilled non-agricultural workers, the other for skilled, unskilled agricultural workers. I'll tell you a little bit more about those in a minute. But with the H1B visa category, it's one of the few categories of non-immigrant worker visas where a person can come into the country without having to convince the person who interviews them at the U.S. consulate in whatever country it is that they're coming from that they have every intention of coming back to their home country after they've finished working, sponsored by an employer in the United States. It's very unusual. Most of those temporary worker categories, they have to be able to convince a consular officer that they have family in their home country, they maybe have a business, property, other things like that that would cause them to want to return as opposed to absconding on their visa. Now, you've heard a lot of talk, I'm sure, over the years about all the illegal aliens we have in the United States, the 11 million or so. Anybody want to take a guess as to how most of those people got here? Because I can assure you that most of them were not farm workers who waded across the Rio Grande River from Mexico to get here. The vast majority of that 11 million people were people who overstayed tourist visas. So they were issued legitimate legal tourist visas by the State Department and by the U.S. Immigration and Customs Service to come to the United States as tourists or students is another big category, and they elected to overstay their visas. The fact that we have that many of them is a pretty good indicator of what a bad job we do keeping track of who's in this country and who isn't in this country. And unfortunately, the public has a lot of angst about that, and we as an industry suffer from that angst, even though we're not a major contributor to the problem. There's another category that you've probably heard a little bit about because it typically is newsworthy from time to time, and that's the refugee and asylee categories. So when you have a civil war going on in Angola, or back in the 80s we had civil wars going on in El Salvador and Nicaragua and Guatemala, we had a lot of people coming to the United States seeking asylum, and you've probably heard all about the wet foot, dry foot issue with Cuban refugees who want to claim asylum and whether they're intercepted at sea by the Coast Guard, in which case they're not eligible for asylum and we have to send them back to Cuba. But if they make it to Florida and get their feet on dry land, they are eligible for asylum. It's the stupidest thing you could possibly imagine. Nobody but a bureaucrat in Washington could have come up with that. But it was a political decision, not a policy decision, which we did a lot of in the years that I was in Washington. That doesn't necessarily make sense, but it's the way things get done to the degree that they ever get done. Refugees and asylees is not going to be a source for agricultural labor for our industry. But that's, Giovanni asked me to talk about some of the different ways that someone could get, who's here illegally can get legal, and that's probably the least common way that it would happen. But it's important to keep in mind, I mentioned before the 3 and 10 year bar that Congress put into immigration law in 1996. If someone crossed illegally, resides in the United States, and they're caught by the Border Patrol, by ICE, by some other enforcement entity, and they are convicted of having resided in the United States illegally, they first will be deported to whatever country it was that they came from, and they will be ineligible for any immigration benefit to be granted by the United States for 3 years if they were in the United States for less than 18 months, or 10 years if they were in the United States for more than 18 months. It is possible, and it's getting to be more and more common, particularly with the Obama administration, for immigration judges to show leniency with people who have been caught illegally in the United States, particularly if they're not a criminal, if they're not a terrorist, if they're employed, if they have family and ties to the community. Very often immigration judges will be willing to shorten the process a little bit for them and find ways to be able to allow them to get some sort of status a little bit sooner. But it's still a difficult road to go down, and it very much depends on sort of what day of the week it is and what side of the bed the immigration judge and the local officials got out of on any given day. So it's not going to be a reliable source, again, for us to try to get a labor force. Another thing that happened related to this, and I have a yellow sheet on my table back there talking to you a little bit more about this, is 2 years ago, you might remember hearing about the Obama administration creating a program called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals was designed to provide a legal status for people who were brought here illegally by their parents when they were still children. So if someone has completed high school, if they've served in the military, they don't have any other criminal record issues or things like that, they're eligible for what in immigration law is called deferred status. And what that means is, again, as I told you before, in theory, if you're apprehended in the United States illegally, at that point you're deportable. But the government, by policy, has the ability to decide to defer your deportation. That's where the deferred part comes from. And to allow other things to unfold to figure out if you might be able to remain in the United States or not. As a matter of policy, with the Deferred Action Program, what the United States government has said is that if you are someone who we think will be of future value to the United States because you completed high school, because you might be contemplating going on to college and doing all the things that we've all been telling our kids to do, and my parents told me to do when I was a kid, is go to college, son, and get yourself a good job, right? So I don't know how good a job this is, but it kind of worked for me. Or someone who served in the military, these are people who are been determined to be of value to us as a country. And so we're going to allow them to remain in the United States, to issue them work authorization and allow them to work. You may be seeing some of these people in agriculture. I don't know if they're out there or not. I know I've talked to a lot of agricultural employers who have had employees seeking deferred action. So I don't know how much of that has happened and how much that allows them to work legally, but that may be some people in circulation that may be available to us as an industry. There's a pretty broad variation in the waiting times for country quotas. The 1966 Immigration Act created quotas for various countries around the globe for how many people we can admit from those countries in any given year. Previous to that time, now remember what the world of the United States was like in 1966, where we were kind of undergoing this liberal ferment where everyone wanted to be, more liberal, more forgiving, more everything. And so we decided, when we were having the debate over immigration reform in 1966, to adjust admission quotas so we were admitting fewer people from Northern Europe and Western Europe and more people from Africa and Asia, South America, and places like that. So it was a really significant shift in the number of people we were admitting from different regions of the world. But because of the way quotas are designed, the amount of people we have here illegally has a direct influence on the number of quotas that are going to be available from any given country. That's the reason why the wait time is so long from countries like Mexico and the Philippines for people to be able to get in here legally if they're petitioned for by a citizen or by a legal permanent resident. Countries with large numbers of illegals are, by definition, going to have much, much smaller quotas than countries that don't. So Ireland is probably the exception because the Irish seem to come and go as they please and not worry too much about formalities like immigration documents and things like that. But if you happen to be a citizen of Great Britain and you want to settle in the United States, it's pretty much automatic. Same thing if you're a citizen of Canada and you want to settle in the United States and become a legal permanent resident. It's not very hard at all. It's a very short and very uncomplicated process. The H2A program, which I think some of you have probably heard of from time to time, right? Do I see any nods in the room? Everybody's heard of the H2A program? Okay, so the H2A program was one of the two, supposedly, and I say unskilled very, very advisedly. This is from the point of view, again, of bureaucrats and politicians in Washington who don't really understand our industry very well and don't appreciate the amount of skill that goes into doing what agricultural workers do. But they created these two categories in the 1986 immigration bill, the H2A program for supposedly unskilled agricultural workers, the H2B program for unskilled non-agricultural workers. The H2B program is for people like hotel maids in the hospitality industry, crab pickers who pick crabs for crab meat that you buy in the grocery store on the east coast of the United States. People like that who are unskilled non-ag, then the H2A program is the program for our industry. The problem with the H2A program is it's a program that's designed to fail. It was designed from the beginning to not ever be a significant source of legal labor for our industry, because the belief of policymakers at the time that the H2A program was created was that if you just pay your people enough money, you'll have all the domestic workers that you need. I think we all know how silly that notion is, but that was the working assumption at the time, and that's why the H2A program, at least partly, is the way that it is. One thing I learned working at the Labor Department is that you never give a bureaucrat a chance to say no, because it's the easiest thing in the world for them to do. And the H2A program is designed to give a bureaucrat not one, not two, but 3 opportunities to say no to you bringing non-domestic workers in the United States to work in agriculture. So in the first instance, you have to convince a pro-union, pro-worker bureaucrat at the Department of Labor that there aren't enough American workers to do the work you need to have done. Tough to do. It's a pretty high bar to overcome, because they come at it with the mindset that if you weren't exploiting your workers and you were treating them decently, you'd have all the workers that you need. So that's the first hurdle you have to overcome. The second is to convince the U.S. Customs and Immigration Service that the workers you want to bring in aren't terrorists. Now, I know there aren't very many Mexican terrorists out there in the world, but they see terrorists behind every telephone pole, because it's their job to do that. So convincing them that these people are not going to be a national security threat is another hurdle that you need to overcome. And last, you have to convince the State Department that these workers don't pose a flight risk. Now, when we already have 11 million illegal aliens in the United States, trying to convince someone from the State Department at the consulate in Guadalajara that these 65 workers that you want to bring in under the H2A program don't pose a potential flight risk in the United States, where they may already have family here that they would like to join, is another pretty tough hurdle that you have to try to overcome. And I think that's one of the reasons why the H2A program probably is not ever going to be viable for us as a source of labor. Once on the farm, and by the way, H2A workers can be petitioned for by employers individually, by associations of farmers, which seems to be the most successful way of doing it so far, or for labor brokers. But once they've crossed the border, once you've gotten them into the country, there are other issues with the H2A program you have to deal with, like paying for all their inbound transportation costs, including their costs of obtaining a visa. Pay for housing and for meals, which you probably don't do with agricultural workers on average. You might in certain cases, but not a lot of others. And to pay a super minimum wage that's referred to as the adverse effect wage rate. The adverse effect wage rate was conceived in the late 1980s as the wage that farmers would have to pay to foreign workers coming into work under the H2A program that would not have a so-called adverse effect on the wages and working conditions of American workers. It's designed to be higher than any wage you would probably pay in a real functioning labor market for agricultural workers in the United States. And it is readjusted every year. Every year they cut the bottom off the distribution of the surveys that they use to determine what the adverse effect wage rate is. So it has an automatic escalator built into it. It's intended, designed to go up and become more expensive year after year after year. And the result of that is that the H2A program accounts for somewhere between 60 and 90,000 agricultural workers coming into the United States every year. And remember, this is an industry that we think employs at least 1.3 to 1.5 million people every year. So you can see that the H2A program effectively is a drop in the bucket, even though it is the only legal means we right now have of getting workers into the country. So all of that, I hope, sets the table for well, this is something else I probably should mention too, is that it's getting harder. We know from experience that it's getting harder and harder to get in. And we know that kind of like you can see an object moving through a room by the shadow on the wall. We know that because we're getting fewer and fewer apprehensions for people trying to cross illegally at the U.S.-Mexico border in all of the various places where people try to cross the border to come into the United States. Those apprehensions have dropped very dramatically over the last 10 years or so. And most researchers think that what we may be having right now is actual net out migration from the United States to Mexico. The reasons for that are, a lot of it's speculative, but a lot of it is things we know because we live it on a day-to-day basis. The economy in the United States right now is not so great. People who have relatives in the United States who are thinking of coming from Mexico are talking to them about an economy that's not so great, and job prospects might not be all that good. Because it's getting to be harder and harder to get physically across the border, it's getting to be more expensive to physically get across the border. Instead of paying Coyote, $500 or $1,000 like you could 10 years ago, now you're paying them $3,000, $5,000, depending on the situation and what part of the border you're trying to get across. So it gets pretty complicated and pretty expensive sometimes. And the other interesting thing that's happening at the same time all this is happening here, is that in Mexico, there are sort of anecdotal signs that the economy is getting a little better. Back in the 1970s, we had this gigantic demographic bulge in Mexico of young people who were not yet working age, but were going to be, growing up in a country whose economy wasn't capable of creating jobs for all of them. And that was the surge of immigrants that we saw in the late 1970s and 1980s that led to the enactment of the 1986 Immigration Act and the farm worker amnesty and all the rest of that we all know the history of all of that. What's happened in the meantime is that the population on average in Mexico is getting older. So that demographic bulge, you know, like the mouse in the belly of a snake, has kind of moved up into an older age cohort. Those people are in their 30s and 40s now. And because of that, largely they're not coming to El Norte to look for jobs. They're able to find jobs in Mexico. Their incomes are higher than they were 10 or 15 years ago on average. And that's created a really interesting effect that I read about in this Pew Hispanic Center survey or study where I got some of this information from. And that is that the fertility of Mexican-born women living in the United States is higher than fertility for Mexican-born women living in Mexico, which I think is kind of interesting because fertility tends to decline with affluence and education. And I think that's a very clear indication of what's going on, and age as well. So as women get older, they tend to become less fertile as well, just because of the natural biological progression as we go through life. So if that's what's happening in Mexico right now, that's another possible explanation for why the immigration from Mexico has slowed so dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years, depending on how you want to measure it. So in 2013, California Farm Bureau was very active with an ad hoc senior staff group that I was a part of, trying to develop a comprehensive proposal for American Farm Bureau to adopt and go to Capitol Hill and go to policymakers in Washington to lobby for, to try to get our arms finally around this problem. It's something we've been talking about for a long time. Like I told you, I started working on it in 1995. Which is an illustration of either how hard the problem is or how bad I am at my job. I'm not really sure which one it is. But I can tell you the politics of immigration reform are extremely tricky. It splits both parties at least 2 different ways, depending on the situation, sometimes more than that. We see the divide very clearly in the Republican Party, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, but there are also divides in the Democratic Party too. And when you have that happening, it just makes it devilishly difficult to put together a winning coalition to get legislation passed. But this idea that this proposal that we developed at American Farm Bureau has 2 primary components. One is that we need to find some way for all the people who are working in our industry now, who don't have legal status now, to allow them to work here, allow them to find a way to be able to continue to work here and continue to reside here and continue to do the jobs that they're doing now that are so vitally important to the ongoing maintenance of our industry. If we were to find ourselves in a position, which is what a lot of people would like to see happen, where we just one day decide that we're actually going to enforce the law, try to round up all these people, all 11 million of them, put them on buses and send them back to wherever it is they came from, that would have a pretty significant impact on our industry. And I don't think that I have to explain to you why that would be, not to mention the economic and social dislocation that it would cause. Interestingly, nobody's really seriously, except for a few of the right-wing nut jobs, and I'm pretty conservative myself, but I recognize that I'm not quite all the way over there. Some of those people are proposing to do those things, but nobody's really taking them very seriously as policymakers. So we need to find a way to allow the people who are here, who are vital to our industry right now, to be able to be here legally. And then at the same time, we need to create a version of the H2A program that actually works, that's designed to work and intended to work from the very beginning. So it would probably have be a 2-branch program, one for people who live off the migrant beaten path, who would want to have contracts with the workers that they work with to ensure themselves that they're actually going to have workers when they need them, in combination with another program that is designed to minimally disrupt the functioning labor markets that we already have, where even though we know we don't have enough workers to go around, we do know from experience that workers and farm labor contractors and growers and other people in our industry have a pretty good idea when jobs are going to be available, when workers are going to be available, where they're going to come from, where the workers need to go to get the jobs, and so on and so forth, because we've been doing it this way for 70 years. And everybody has a pretty good idea how this process works. What we don't want to do is create national policy that upsets that functioning labor market, functioning market in information. Because remember, economies are all about exchange of information. If people don't have enough information to act on, they don't know how to act in their self-interest. So a bureaucratic program that gets in the way of that exchange of information would be a disaster for what ability we already have to be able to distribute workers and for workers to be able to find jobs in our industry. So the policy balance is going to be very critically important. A big part of that is going to be to not impose the H2A program's super regulatory infrastructure on this new guest worker program. So basically what we would do, the vision that we had, is that you basically treat these workers like you would treat farm workers now. They're covered by MISPA, they're going to be covered by California labor law, they'll be covered by federal labor law, and be treated in largely the same way. You wouldn't have to pay them a super minimum wage. Depending on the situation, it might be necessary for political purposes to have to pay for a housing stipend or to provide housing if you have it. That's a political question that we're going to need to answer as we get a little further down the road. There's one very important piece of this that absolutely has to get done, or else at the end of the day we really haven't accomplished very much, and that's a waiver of the 3 and 10-year bar that I was telling you about before, because virtually everyone who's working illegally in our industry would be subject to the 3 and 10-year bar. So we need to find a way to get around that problem. The visas in this guest worker program are going to be portable visas. Workers will be permitted to work for whoever they want. That's a substantial sea change from the way employer-sponsored visa programs work now, where the worker is tied to you as the employer that petitioned to have that worker enter the United States, and you are legally responsible for that worker in the sense that you're supposed to ensure that that worker will not become a ward of the state. That is, you're going to provide employment for them so they will contribute to the economy and not detract from the economy. The ability to allow these visas to be portable, to move from employer to employer, is the thing that gives workers the ability to be able to vote with their feet, if you will, just as they do now, to go to work for employers that they want to work for, as opposed to being forced to work for the employer who petitioned for them initially. It's getting politically to be harder and harder and harder all the time to justify forcing workers to continue to work for a single employer because that employer petitioned to bring them into the United States. We all know why that is, and at the time that policy was created, it made perfect sense. But with the growing awareness of international human trafficking and other issues related to that, defending that position is getting to be harder all the time. So that's among the reasons why it's pretty important to allow labor, and that's also the other way you allow labor markets to function, is to allow workers to move freely from one employer to another. Oh, one important thing that I forgot to mention is that unlike the current H2A program, and unlike kind of the world we live in already, where we have this gotcha litigation culture, particularly in California, with guest workers under this program, the grower would have a 30-day right to cure a civil violation. That would be failure to provide adequate notice of the wages that the worker got paid, failure to pay them on time, things like that. Not things that have to do with safety and health of workers, but things that have to do with the paperwork that goes along with employing workers. And I think all of us know in California, we have a lot of paperwork when it comes to employing people in this state. So rather than heading straight to court, as soon as you have a problem with your paperwork, the idea here is to give the employer an opportunity to fix the problem before you go to court. So the opponents are the usual suspects. Certain of the sort of lefty, liberal, do-gooder groups that think that employers by definition are bad people, as well as some of your other farm worker advocacy groups like California Rural Legal Assistance. One big one that's been making a lot of noise is the Farm Worker Justice Fund. I call them the so-called Farm Worker Justice Fund, because I'm reasonably sure the guy that runs the Farm Worker Justice Fund probably hasn't talked to a farm worker in 20 years. But he gets a lot of money from liberal foundations to be able to run his organization, and thus he has the ability to go out to Capitol Hill and represent himself as an advocate for farm workers. We also have this immigration restrictionist wing in the Republican Party, represented by people like Numbers USA, Federation for American Immigration Reform, and organizations like that. These people have the ability to be able to generate massive amounts of telephone calls, emails, letters, things like that to congressional offices, to other key political figures like that. And I'll be honest with you and tell you that we have never been able to match that. Never been able to match the number of phone calls, the number of letters. What we can bring to bear is not numbers but quality, because all of you are employers and all of you make an important contribution in your communities, and politicians tend to understand and know that intuitively. So while there is a certain amount of weighing the mail that goes on in Washington, sometimes quality can overcome quantity, but just understand that these people are very active, very well funded, and can generate a lot of grassroots activity. The supporters include the industry. It's American Farm Bureau and the Ag Workforce Coalition, which takes in virtually the entire agricultural industry in Washington that represents the portions of agriculture that employ people. There's an interesting new coalition that's emerged in the last 6 months called Bibles, Badges, and Business. So it encompasses, it's a project of one of the Silicon Valley bazillionaires, and I can't remember which one it is. He's the one that's primarily funding it. But what they've done is they've brought together people of faith, people involved in law enforcement like Margaret Mims, who's the sheriff in Fresno County, who's one of the most vocal of the people involved in this, as well as employers, to talk about the need from a more communitarian basis for some kind of immigration reform. We have people living in our midst who are in effect in the shadows, who don't want to go to law enforcement even when they have a problem that law enforcement could help them fix. And it's in our interest for them to be able to go to law enforcement, to have a law-abiding, orderly community to live in. And then you combine that with representatives of religious movements that span the ideological spectrum, from Sojourners on the left to the Southern Baptist Convention on the right, that are all saying pretty much the same things, that are, to paraphrase, that Jesus would not approve of our immigration policy. Let me put it that way in one simple sentence. It's a very interesting effect they've got going on in Washington with the people they're talking to and the impact that they're making. Another thing that's new, that's just cropped up in the last 6 weeks, is the Partnership for a New American Economy. Now that Michael Bloomberg is no longer the mayor of New York City, he has a lot more freedom to do political things that he's interested in doing. Even though he served as mayor of New York City and they pay you, in Michael's world, next to nothing to do that job, he's still an umpty gazillionaire. And he's still got money coming out of his ears. And he's always been interested in immigration reform. He's created the Partnership for a New American Economy, and PNAE is working across the spectrum of employer organizations and people who are interested in immigration reform to push policymakers in Washington to try to make something happen. So always good to have more voices and more money involved in the debate. And what's interesting is that this degree of people other than us talking about this problem is getting louder and louder and louder all the time. That gives me some sense of optimism that sometime in my lifetime we might actually be able to get this done. So what's the holdup? Well, to be blunt, for my Republican friends, and I'm a lifelong Republican, I don't know if I should say that here or not, or if anybody cares, but our friends in the Tea Party are very closely allied with organizations like FAIR and English First and some of those organizations that don't want to see immigration reform happen. And some of the conservative restrictionists that I was talking to you about before. Part of what's happening with Republicans, by the way, and Republicans as a party are far from innocent. They're politicians just like everybody else is. And what's happening for Republicans right now is, even though they probably could do immigration reform if they wanted to, and several major constituencies that are part of their national coalition want them to do immigration reform, right now they have a great big club that they're beating the daylights out of Democrats with, and that's the gigantic flame out of Obamacare and the implementation of Obamacare. And right now Republicans don't want to change the subject. They think that this is something that helps them. It's an unalloyed help to them winning the Senate in November and maybe carrying over to the presidential election in 2016. So for now, they don't want to change the conversation from something that's a political benefit to them to something that's going to be politically hard and has the potential to have different people in the party going in different directions. So just understand that's the background to this, and a lot of what's going on here is they want to have that conversation about Obamacare. They don't want to talk about other things. For Democrats, interestingly, the farm worker advocacy groups, particularly United Farm Workers, is in our camp. on figuring out how to do immigration reform and the basic components of how it would all fit together. But the industrial unions, the old line industrial unions, and some of the public sector unions that are the only part of the union movement that's growing right now, don't really like immigration reform. They kind of subscribe to the old idea that somehow an economy is a pie that never grows. And so any slice, if your slice is bigger, my slice by definition is going to be smaller. As opposed to, I think what makes more sense is, let's make the pie bigger so everybody gets a bigger slice. But that's not the way some people think, and that's a lot of what the division is about going on in the Democratic Party right now. For everybody in Washington, there's a lot of political inertia going on. There's a lot of enmity, a lot of bad blood. I've heard politicians and staffers on Capitol Hill in Washington say things, I swear, I've heard them say this many times, that the other party is the opposition, but the other house is the enemy. And that's a really interesting attitude, particularly when the people that run that house might be the same party as your party, and your staff might have worked for their staff and vice versa over the years. So there's a lot of animosity that needs to be overcome in order to overcome this inertia. But at the end of the day, the inertia is largely caused by the fact that both sides sometimes would rather have a political stick to beat their opponent with than they would want to fix the problem. Because once you fix a problem, I had a friend that I worked with in Washington for years who had what he called the pressure cooker theory of politics, where if you let a problem fester for years and years and years, eventually it starts to create enough political pressure that you can actually get something done. But if you prematurely relieve the pressure in the pressure cooker doesn't explode and nothing changes. And so over time, there gets to be this sort of gamesmanship, one-upsmanship of people trying to find better sticks to beat the other guy with than actually trying to solve the problem. It's an unfortunate characteristic of the way people do things in Washington, but I think it's the truth. So I don't have any other brilliant conclusions to offer you, but I would be happy to answer any questions you might have, unless I've beaten you to death by talking to you about this for this long.
One of the questions I have is, when you provide housing for the people that you bring in, does that become part of the tax structure, such as workman's comp, as part of their payroll, and on and on?
Now, would it be considered, I think the question you're asking is, would it be considered part of the value of their overall compensation? Not for the purposes of calculating workers' compensation. It probably would for tax purposes, but that would be something that we would need to see what the IRS's view about that is when we get to that point. So I think at this point, in some respects, that's going to be an unknown. We just don't know yet.
We used to have a program called the Bracero Program that was pretty effective.
Yeah.
Can you explain, one, why it died, and two, why it couldn't be reinvented?
Okay. You're old enough to remember Edward R. Murrow and Harvest of Shame, aren't you?
Yeah.
That's the answer to your question about what happened to the Bracero Program. There was a perception that the Bracero Program exploited Mexican workers, who, rightly or wrongly, but that was the political perception of the program at the time. And so it was very difficult politically to continue to support it. And it died in 1965 when we were in a position where we seemed to have enough domestic labor to be able to do what needed to be done in agriculture. But of course, that changed over time. The other problem with the Bracero Program is, you might remember the huge scandal about the part of their wages that had to be withheld and given back to the Mexican government. The Mexican government, being the Mexican government, stole it from these workers. And so workers have been suing the Mexican government, the American government, and anybody else they can think of to sue. And some of these cases are just now being settled in federal district court in Sacramento and some other places just in the last year. So that's a long time. That's my entire lifetime that these people have been trying to get wages that they were owed 40 years, 50 years ago almost. So that, I think, is the answer to your question about why the Bracero Program, the H2A Program, as bad as it is, was an outgrowth of the Bracero Program, of the political desire to try to protect farm workers from exploitation. Of course, some of that exploitation supposedly was by their employers, but a lot of the exploitation was perpetrated by their own government.
So you view the H2A program as a parallel or sister or brother to the Bracero program?
I would say more like bastard stepchild, redheaded bastard stepchild of the Bracero Program. The Bracero Program was great in a lot of ways. a lot of people were able to come to the United States and work and earn money and send it back home and come and go as they wanted to come and go because it was a relatively flexible program. But it acquired a bad political rap. I don't know whether it was justified or not. I wasn't there, so I don't know what was happening. All I can tell you is what the historical result was. And the historical result was that the judgment of history has been that the Bracero program was a bad program. And as a result, I think bringing it back, or something that looks like it, is going to be very politically difficult to do. On the other hand, I have 4 field staff that work for me at Fells. 2 of them, their fathers or grandfathers came to the United States as Braceros and were able to get legal after they came here as Braceros. So a lot of people of Mexican descent who live in the United States now have family members who came here as Braceros in the first place. So it made a significant contribution and change in the nature of our country. But trying to bring it back, I think, is just a political impossibility.
What are they doing, or do they have a program like the Bracero program in Canada?
The one thing you have to keep in mind is that the growing season in most of Canada is about 45 days. So they don't have the ability to grow the kind of labor-intensive crops that we do here with our incredibly long growing seasons where you can get 3 crops of leafy greens in the Salinas Valley a lot of the time. So Canada doesn't have nearly the need for the sheer numbers of workers that we have in the United States, but they do have a program that does resemble the Bracero program in many ways that allows workers to be able to move back and forth and come relatively freely. But the kind of numbers you're talking about with that program are less than half of the H2A program right now. So that as a model, I don't think is something that's going to work for us. Plus we have the experience, the quote-unquote bad experience of the Bracero program that I think would keep us from being able to go that route.
I have one observation or one statement. I've been privileged to travel extensively in Mexico, and my wife and I own a home there. And I think the United States government and this group underestimate the economic improvement and the economic vehicle that Mexico is riding right now. I mean, I've been in extremely remote villages in Mexico, and there's not a village that I have not been in that there is not new housing being built. Mm-hmm. And if you take a look at a company called Cemex and look at, granted it's a monopolistic company, if you take a look at the growth of Cemex, that is a thumbprint of what is happening in Mexico. And with that economic improvement comes jobs, and why leave Mexico and come to the United States and get hassled when they can get a job building a road in Mexico?
That's exactly the point I was making a minute ago, about 15 minutes ago, is that as the economy gets better in Mexico, people are going to have less and less of an incentive to want to come to the United States, as opposed to the way things were in the 1970s when we had this big demographic bubble of young people that the economy wasn't going to be able to create enough jobs for, and that's what led to their massive out-migration. And from what I can understand, Mexicans didn't like that any better than a lot of Americans did. They felt like it was a brain drain, that they were sending their best and their brightest people to another country to contribute in that country as opposed to staying in their own. So in the long run, it's a problem for us as an industry, but it's probably better for Mexico. But you can't underestimate how different it's going to be in the future.
Thank you, Bryan.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Bryan.